Saanich Gulf Islands.
And thanks to members here gathered to study supplementary estimates. I particularly am grateful for the opportunity to participate in this. I want to begin by acknowledging we're on Algonquin territory, and to the Algonquin peoples, say miigwech. Before I begin, because this is probably the last time for quite a while I'll have a chance to address my friends here, and I like to think that we're all friends, and I want to start by saying that when you look around the world, the countries that have the least partisan approach to COVID-19 are the countries that have done the best. In fact, it's often pointed out in the media these days that the countries with women leaders have done particularly well. Iceland, Finland, Norway, Denmark, New Zealand, Germany, and Taiwan. And on top of the fact that those countries happen to have women leaders, there's something also significant about the nonpartisanship that occurs in a system when you don't vote using first past the post. All of those countries use some form of proportional representation in electing their governments. And I've come to believe over my years in this place and my years in politics that first past the post tends to encourage the worst instincts in politics. And I think the worst instincts in politics would be at this moment when Canadians are looking to us as elected members to work together. It would be poor form not to thank the people I stand looking at this time. That's why I came to this side of the House, because I want to thank you. I don't imagine any of you have had a day off for a long time. If Canadians think we aren't here working, we're working. I know my colleague there from Edmonton is working, and I know we're working wherever we are. I know that for me, since March 13th when we adjourned, and I'm not looking for sympathy, but I know my one day off was Mother's Day. So I'm hoping that all of us figure out we'll be back here July 8th, but I know that you, your senior civil servants, and your families have been feeling this because they haven't seen. If you're in a front bench in this government, you've been working darn hard to try to help all Canadians. To the extent that it's fallen short, yes, we have to make you accountable. But I can't say that I don't think the people sitting in front of me here today have not been working their hearts out to try to help Canadians, and for that I want to thank you. It's not been easy for anyone, and I know that when we can be less partisan, we'll do a better job. Now, I do want to reflect, as many members of opposition have, on the sliding concept which has been falling out of favor for a very long time. It's not, this is what I want to talk about, it's sort of my unfortunately very long and good memory. But Parliament is supposed to control the public purse. There's no question that the Parliamentary Budget Officer is right. 4 hours isn't enough to study the supplementary estimates. But it came to me the other day, when was it I last felt like this? Well, when I was first elected, my first speech from the throne was June 3rd, 2011. Now, how would I remember? Well, because what happened was, it was some weeks later that it began to be discussed in the media. How could Parliament have approved, without studying at all, billions of dollars in supplementary estimates? There was a hue and a cry. And I thought, I'm pretty darn diligent. I couldn't have missed that. How could there have been a unanimous consent motion that I missed? I'm always here. How could it have happened? Well, what happened on June 3rd was it was the speech from the throne. And we were in center block, as other members, like the Minister of Transportation, will remember those days, and I hadn't had my hip replacement yet. So by the time it took me to walk from the Senate back down the Hall of Honor to get back to my desk in this place, $6 billion in supplementary estimates had been deemed to have been studied, deemed to have been passed, and deemed done and toasted and dusted and done by unanimous consent. Now, had I been here, other than limping down the hall in my cane, I would have said, hold your horses. We're not going to approve $6 billion in supplementary estimates without studying them. So I'm just offering that up to say the fact that that happened then doesn't make 4 hours right now. But we weren't in a pandemic then. So I will say we have a few more excuses for having different kinds of procedures. I will hold this government to account and make sure that when we resume, and I gather we will look at main estimates again, we will have more time to study, that we really do have the opportunity to study. But in pandemic, it's also no excuse not to have real Parliament. I've never been part of the House leaders' discussions, obviously, but I would have preferred that we hadn't come up with a COVID-19 committee format, because quite honestly, we were doing most of what gets to happen in the House of Commons. If we had seen this coming, we should have created two sets of standing orders, one for when things are normal and one for when we can't meet. And I take the points that have been made by the Leader of the Official Opposition. This Parliament met right through the Second World War. Well, sure, there was no reason not to right through the Second World War. We weren't all contagious. We can't all sit here side by side and go back and forth to our ridings without risking us being disease vectors and contaminating our communities. But it's still not adequate. So I'm on both sides of the fence on this. And before we get through much more pandemic, I hope we can have full House of Commons at a distance. The only missing piece is the voting at a distance, which we could easily do. Once we add that piece in, we can take on the legislation that needs to be studied. We could have full, long studies of every single aspect of every budget on meetings of the committee. The Finance Committee's been meeting. I attend regularly. It's hearing from dozens of witnesses. We have the technology to allow Parliament to meet. And that is what I hope we will do, because we need to see democracy in action, and for democracy to be in action, every single Canadian needs to be represented by their own member of Parliament, not by proxy, not by party whips. Everybody needs to be engaged, and that's what happens when we have the hybrid model, which we've shown the technology works. Our only problem is we're not using the standing orders for Parliament. We're using committee rules because it's a COVID-19 committee. It does hold people to account, and I have to say, Madam Speaker, I don't know about how you feel about it, but I think the 5-minute rounds are far more interesting and bring more interesting information to light than 30 seconds back and forth, and as in our normal standing rules for question period. In any case, I want to turn to questions that I have about the supplementary estimates. And I will turn to the ministers and ask, I think my first question really would normally be to the Minister for Public Security. I'm not sure who's taking questions relating to the RCMP, but it's the Minister of Transportation. So I'd like to turn to the supplementary estimates now and start my questions, if that's all right, Madam Speaker, with the time I have. So on page 2-59, Honourable Minister, I'm wondering if we can get some detail. On the record, obviously, the Green Party is very much in favour of the new over $380 million to compensate members of the RCMP for injuries received in the performance of their duty. But there's an unexplained item here of $18 million. And for people watching from home, the total budget of the RCMP is on the order of $3.7 billion. So $18 million is a pretty trifling amount out of a $3.7 billion budget. But since it's not explained, I wonder if the Honourable Minister can tell us and assure us that any $18 million in this line item is not for anything that in the context of our current deep concern about systemic racism within the RCMP and a militarized response to peaceful protesters, and the things that are now current in our conversation through Parliament and the media. What is this $18 million for? And I'm hoping it might be for de-escalation training.
L'Honorable Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to reassure my colleague that it is not for any of the things that she was asking about. This is an $18.1 million for the balance of the funding announced in Budget 2019 to strengthen Royal Canadian Mounted Police policing operations. But very specifically, that's what it's described as. This $18.1 million will be used to ensure that we have sufficient number of cadets, RCMP cadets, going to the depot, which is where they train. And it also will include elements such as recruitment, cultural awareness, and de-escalation specifically. Wow. So this funding is integral to ensuring that we meet our commitments to government priorities. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I turn now to the Minister responsible for Indigenous Services, because we've been waiting a long time for a response from the government more than a year. As a matter of fact, the day that inquiry was delivered, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls inquiry was delivered at the Museum of History. I actually was squeezed next to it. It was close quarters. I was sitting with the Honourable Minister as that report was released. It's been a long wait. You weren't a minister. The minister wasn't the minister then. I can't address him directly. But it's been a long wait for a response, and I see 3 different funding items in 3 different pockets for responding to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls final report. And some of it from CMHC, some of it from the parallel agency Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and the Department of Indigenous Services. I wonder if, since we have not yet had a political response, what is the funding response?
L'Honorable Ministre.
I must confess I'm having some difficulty seeing the member opposite on the other side of the House. It's much more comforting to have her here, although she does keep us quite heavily to account, as people paying attention can clearly hear. The member will have noticed, and I think underlining her point is the fact that the National Action Plan is not a static document. Vote 10 in particular has $6 million appropriated to continue engagement with members, including families and survivors, for the calls to justice. The member will also have noticed that, or noted last week, that we announced $40 million for 10 youth shelters across Canada. This is not a static document, and I would take the time to also say that this is not a federal document. This is a document that involves input from provinces, from territories, most importantly from Indigenous peoples that guide the way forward as to how we move forward as a nation. And so the funding response is one element. We did not wait to do so. There is a legislative response that is embodied in C91 on Indigenous languages, C92 on child and family services. These are all part of what we call a whole-of-government approach, but underscoring that, more importantly, should be the fact this is about keeping people safe, and the most vulnerable people, Indigenous women and children, safe in our country as we move forward. And again, the document is not a static document. It'll be a guide forward as to how we move forward as a nation.
Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just to the Honourable Minister again, I haven't, and it's probably because there isn't this level of specificity, or maybe I've missed it, but I do think friendship centres are terribly important, particularly for urban Indigenous peoples, and I wonder if there is anything in the supplementary estimates that speaks to the needs of friendship centres across Canada.
L'Honorable Ministre.
And Madam Speaker, an exceedingly important question. In Budget 2019, there were tens of millions of dollars invested in infrastructure and support for friendship centres. This was a historic amount, as we have seen the pressure that we have received from urban Indigenous groups that are serving Indigenous peoples. Indeed, half of the Indigenous population off reserve. Clearly, that pressure from a financial perspective has been seen and felt. We deployed $15 million on an emergency basis to supply Indigenous communities or service organizations that needed to help people in urban settings. And we also recently allocated $75 million to further increase that overwhelming demand that we received in Indigenous services.
The Honourable Member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Turning my attention to tourism, I'm looking at the document and see within the economic development portfolios certain amounts of money, but I wonder if there's a single figure that one can look at, because honestly at this point, Madam Speaker, the businesses that I'm particularly worried about that are still falling between the cracks are in the tourism sector, and I wonder if the Honourable Minister can point to a single number out of these documents, because I think perhaps tourism funding is found in a few different pockets.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Indeed, dear colleague, the tourism support is across the economic development portfolio. We've already announced $70 million. That's $30 million through Destination Canada to support really destination marketing organizations. We call them DMOs all across the country. We're also supporting businesses directly, but if she would like to have more information, we would it would be useful, of course, we can send the information to her.
There's 30 seconds left.
The Minister of Transport was earlier asked by my colleague about the funding for Via Rail. In the last few moments, did any further details surface in briefing notes? Because I'm very supportive of Via Rail, and I wonder where the money is going.
Very, very brief answer. The Honourable Minister.
My answer that I gave before is the most recent answer to my colleague.